Hi there, and welcome back to another wonderful video for the Do-It-Yourself book cover design series. So far, we have created our book cover from a series of stock photography assets. We have blended those and composited those images together into a scene, and we've done some very simple post-design enhancement of the image, which is what you're looking at currently on the screen right now. Today, we're going to talk about how to typeset a cover, and I'm going to give you a few very simple tips on making the type fit into a scene and choosing the right font. And then, of course, laying out the rest of the cover. So why don't we go ahead and just jump right in and get started. I'll try to keep these videos a little shorter than the prior ones, which I think were quite long. So you'll notice in the layer set on the right that there is a text folder. And the text folder is broken up into groups that represent the front cover, the spine, and the back cover. Each of those has their own set of typographic assets you may want to create. We're going to begin with just the front cover, and then we'll come back around to our back cover and our spine. So let's talk about selecting a font. We've got a book cover here for a small town murder mystery, and while I think it's probably instinctual that a new designer wants to do something that will stand out and draw attention to itself, oftentimes when someone chooses a font for that specific reason, it works against them in that it confuses a reader who recognizes that this might be a genre story, but the fonts don't quite line up. So let's give an example here. If we were to type our title, which is Can't Go Home, you'll notice that it's a little bit dim, even though I've selected black. That's because our filters layer is on. Later we may move this below the text, so the text lives on top of it, or we may actually blend the text into the filtered layer. We'll see how that works out. For now, let's turn it off. Okay. In fact, let's not turn it off. Let's move our text above it. Okay, so that gives us a clearer look at the text. Now, I'm going to size this up a bit just for the purpose of demonstration. But let's say you're a brand new cover designer and you want to choose a very interesting font for your cover. Let's say you really like the way this font looks. This is the kind of mistake that first-time designers will often make, which is choosing a font that they think is visually interesting or stylish, and a font that might serve many perfectly legitimate purposes out in the world, but as a typeface for their particular genre cover, it doesn't tell a reader anything reassuring. So let's say this is your typeface for your cover. Someone looks at this cover, the type actually feels whimsical. Whereas the cover itself feels kind of brooding and ominous. This is exactly the kind of thing that will prevent someone from picking up a book because they can't reconcile those two very different elements. So this is where the familiarity of genre tropes kind of comes into play for a book cover. In a previous post, we looked at a series of political and spy thriller type book covers. And there are a lot of things that those books have in common, despite being written by different authors and published by different houses and designed by different designers. There are certain typographic cues that you can give a reader to tell them what kind of a book they're looking at. So a font like this doesn't give that cue. But if we were to select, let's say, a font like Trade Gothic and a bolder version of that font. And if we were to make that nice and large, which is obviously too large for our space, but you get the idea. Now I'm moving quickly, but I'll show you how I do this sort of thing in a moment. If this were our cover, then immediately I think people understand more of the tone of what they're looking at. They might recognize the font, but if they don't, they certainly recognize what the font is trying to say, which is This is very serious. We don't have time to screw around here. It's a very solid, strong font, and it communicates the fact that this story is it's not going to waste your time. It's going straight for um, a particular emotion, and it wants to be serious. So that's why font choice can be so important. We're going to actually choose Gotham for our font. Now, in the test run that I did, that's the font that I used, and I'll show you that again. We used Gotham here. You can see it's a nice, strong, blocky font. It's very serious. You can see just based on the fact that the G has hard edges in it. This font is meant for evoking that particular emotion. So it's serious, and I think it makes a lot of sense for this particular design. It also is a nice little throwback to the Gone Girl poster that I used as a reference in a previous post. Gone Girl, if I'm not mistaken, used a variation of Futura for its cover, and it might have been something like Futura. Like that looks reasonably close. Might actually just be bold. And this would work as well. Although I tend to think of Futura as just a bit more of a modern and even future casting kind of font, just based on the fact that its different weights have very, very sharp edges in places, like so. And that feels very modern or even kind of cold to me. None of which suggests that this would not be a good font choice. We're just not going to use it for this example. So we're going to use Gotham, and we're going to use the regular weight. Now I'm working in the character palette right here. You can access that under the window menu. If you choose character or paragraph, those tend to open as tabs in the same window palette. So now we have selected our type font, but having it live on top of this design as pure black, or let's say as pure white, it's not necessarily a poor decision, but the type doesn't appear to live in the design. It's very separate from the design, and I want it to live in the design just a little bit more. So we're going to choose a color that's actually drawn from the design itself. And I really like this sort of dark, murky red that's right here. And as you can see in the color picker, it's actually a little less red and a little bit more purple. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, I like that already because this feels like something that belongs in the design to me. I like the emphasis on the words. I think that the type size is actually quite good. It makes it very, very clear what we're trying to do here. And the giant word home emphasizes that this land below is home, and yet something very, very disturbing is happening. So now we could stop right there, and that would be a nice, clean bit of type for the cover. But I want to do a little bit more to continue to make it feel like it belongs here. So there are some simple effects that I'm going to show you that I often use on a cover. And I try to use them sparingly, or at the very least, very subtly. You can err on the side of too much, and it shows. Readers will still pick it up for sure, but I think it's simpler to be subtle and trust that a small effect is usually enough to help something stand out. So we're going to make sure we have the black and white colors selected here, and we're going to double click the layer. Now if you double click the type, that'll let you change the name of the layer, like so. If you were to double click the icon, that will select the text itself. So you want to double click anywhere in the blank space of that layer name, and that will give you the layer style palette. Now there are a lot of options here. We're not going to use them all. If you use them all, you're probably going to tell someone that you're very Photoshop happy and you're very excited to be using Photoshop. Instead, we're going to be very subtle. I think we're going to play with a very soft gradient over the text, some very, very subtle beveling, and probably an outer glow just to help add to the murky nature of the scene. So let's start with our gradient overlay. Let me move this window over here, and I'll slide our palette over. Now the default gradient overlay, of course, is a solid black to a solid white. That's not what we want to go for. Obviously, that changes the intent of our very purposeful color selection a moment ago. So this is where blend modes come into play. And right here in the gradient overlay palette, you can see that you can select a different blend mode. And I like to go with soft light. And you can see soft light will take the properties of the color beneath it, but I don't like the fact that it has turned the top half of the gradient of the type sort of a violet color. Let's look at this again. Normal, you can see it's a solid black at the bottom of the gradient, solid white at the top, which means when you go to soft light, you're going to have a very dark base purple that comes through this part of the gradient overlay, and you'll have a very pale version of the purple coming through up here. So we want to actually change the gradient to be a black to transparent gradient, very similar to what we've used for masks and that sort of thing. And that's also a bit harsh, although kind of nice. But we're going to set it to soft light, and I'm going to actually reverse the gradient. So this little reverse toggle right here will turn the gradient upside down. And that gives us a black to transparent gradient from top to bottom. Now you can play with the scale. This will be very hard to see clearly, so I'm just going to describe it. But the scale will stretch the gradient or compress the gradient. So at the small end of the scale, you can see that we have a very tight blend from black to transparent. At the high end, that gradient stretches all the way down. So we're going to keep it somewhere in the middle. And I'm happy with the angle. I'm happy with the style of gradient. I don't think we need to explore those, although those are options. But I'm not particularly happy with how dark it is here. So I'm going to bring the opacity down just a bit so that it's a very subtle effect. Now it goes from sort of a wine color to a slightly brighter wine color. We're not going to stop here, so we're not going to close this palette just yet. I mentioned that we were going to use a bevel. Now, bevels by default are very, very obvious. They're very pillowy. Anyone who uses a bevel like this is communicating to a designer, at the very least, that this is the first time that you've used the bevel tool, and you're perfectly content with the way it looks. I don't like this, and I certainly wouldn't put this on a cover. What I will do with the bevel tool, however, is create a very slim highlight edge on a piece of text. So I'm going to change a few things over here to create that effect. The first thing I'm going to do is set the size of the bevel to 0, which sounds counterintuitive, but I promise you it's not. I'm going to change the shading angle and remove the global light feature. Now, global light means if you were to select this, then every filter and every effect that you apply to a layer will have the same light source. That's usually a good thing, but since we're not doing heavy effects work here, and we're just affecting a single piece of type, we're going to set this ourselves. So I'm going to set it to a 90-degree angle, which means it's coming straight from above. Down here where you have the highlight and shadow mode, I'm going to turn the shadow off entirely, and I'm going to turn the highlight all the way up. Now, this is the end of the changes that I'm making to the bevel. And you might think, well, nothing happened. And on its surface, it appears that you're right. But I'm going to zoom in here, and we'll show you exactly what it did. So over here on the right, you can see that each of the effects you've applied are laid out below. You can turn those off with the eye tool. And you'll notice that there's a very subtle highlight across the top of the E that the bevel has created. And that'll be more obvious when we apply our outer glow. But we don't want it to be too obvious. Subtle is good. So let's zoom back out. We're going to go back into that effects palette. You can get there by double-clicking any one of these, by the way. We're going to select outer glow. Now, the default outer glow is white, and it's set to a screen. You can see how it kind of creates this halo around the text. That's not what we're looking for. So I'm going to select the color, set it to black, just by dragging all the way to the bottom. You'll notice it appears to have gone away, and that's because black will not be visible in a screen blend mode. So we're going to set it to multiply. Now we have a very heavy black glow, and you can see that that beveled edge is a little bit more visible right here. That's, of course, way, way, way too harsh and looks just about as bad as the original bevel, the default bevel. What we're going to do instead is mess with the size and the spread of this particular glow. So spread allows you to define how how strong the bounding border of that glow is, whereas size determines how far it goes from the source. Now, I'm just going to be honest, that's very shitty looking. That's not what we're going for. What we're going for instead is a very subtle spread, maybe about a 3 or so, and a very subtle size. So let's try like a 20. And go a little higher than that, about like this. In fact, we might not even need the spread. Now, you'll notice in the opacity we're set at 75, and it almost looks like there are like black cobwebs collecting around the text. And that's not at all what we want, so we're going to take it way, way down. And now you can see we have this faint, sort of dusty, almost murky outline around the text. So I want that to take on the feel of the text color a bit more. So I'm going to select the color and change it here. And I'm going to grab a middle ground color from our text layer and apply that. And now it feels almost like we have sort of a dark glow around the text, but it echoes the color of the text itself. So that's about as far as I want to go with the simple effects on the text. I actually, now looking at it from the distance, I actually feel like that outer glow is still a bit too harsh, so I'm going to bring it down to 15% and put that away. Now, okay, we've defined that, and this text, of course, looks very flat still. So there's a very simple way to duplicate a layer effect onto another piece of text, and that is to hold down the Option key and click the effect, the word effects, and drag that to the next layer, and then release it. And you'll see that it's applied the same kind of styling to the words can't go. There's one more thing that I want to do just to give these words a bit more texture and to make them feel like they belong in this sky, and that's to give them a cloud texture. Now, I did this with the test run, which you can see here. There's sort of just some shadows and highlights over the text, and that's because we have some cloud layers that are specifically limited to the text themselves. So we're going to create that very quickly. So let's go down into the art folder, and we'll scroll down to this cloud texture layer, and I want to duplicate that, but I also want to drag it way, way up to the top so it's next to the text. So instead of just duplicating the layer, I'm going to hold down Option and click and drag it. And just like with the effects, that will allow us to drag that layer to the very top. Now the layer is set to a soft light, so you can see how it's affected the entire cover. If I turn that off and back on, we don't want to do that. We want it to be restricted just to the word home. So we're going to use something called a clipping mask here. And the way to use a clipping mask is you can click Layer and go to Create Clipping Mask, or you can hit Option Command G on your keyboard, which is usually the shortcut that I'll use. But let's go ahead and create that. And you'll see that there's now a tiny little arrow next to the layer, and it's indented a bit. And that's designed to tell you that the layer only affects the layer below it. So the cloud texture, even though it applies to even though its size is for the whole cover, you can see now that as I move it around, it only lives over the word home. So I've just resized it and dragged it to a place where I'm happy with. So I'm going to hit Enter to commit that. And now you'll see that we have a cloud layer that's applied directly to the text. I think it's a bit strong, so I'm going to try a few things here. One thing you can do occasionally with a layer like this is invert it. Because it's a black and white layer, you can hit Command I to invert the colors. You can kind of see here in the thumbnail what it's done. Unfortunately, that makes it way too dark here, so I'm going to re-invert that. And I'm just going to play with the opacity instead until we get to a point where I'm comfortable with the amount of the cloud that's visible and with the variations in the color that it creates. So at 60%, I am comfortable with that. Let's zoom in a little more closely And now you can see very, very subtly we have some texture applied um, to this layer. You can see it move around as I choose to drag it. So we also want to create that effect on the words can't go. So again, we're going to hold down Option, click our cloud texture layer, drag it above can't go. Now it's not clipped to the words can't go, so we want to apply that clipping mask. So again, Command Option G, and now the cloud layer is restricted to just the words can't go. All right, let's zoom out and see how this feels. I think we've got a pretty nice looking title here now. After staring at it just a bit longer, I really don't like the fact that the outer glow is as noticeable as it is. So I'm going to change it, and I can do that by double-clicking Outer Glow. I actually want to increase the size so it goes a little bit wider and it blends a little more naturally with the background. But I'll leave the spread and the opacity the same. And I also want to reduce the bevel. So I'm going to click on the bevel. I'm going to reduce the screen highlight, which is what creates that top edge. I'm going to reduce that down to 70%. And now you'll notice what you might not notice, but the properties of this text layer, the word home, are different now from can't go. So again, you can hold down Option, click the word effects that's associated with the home layer, and drag it onto can't go. And that will automatically replace the effects on can't go with our new effects. So let's zoom out again. I'm much happier with the way that looks. All right, we're going to stop here just because I want to break these up into smaller videos. In the next one, we'll look at applying the author's name, the jacket quote, a blurb per se, and some of the other text that we want to echo on our spine and back cover. So thanks for watching, and be sure to check out the next video.